Alrighty, while folks are still trickling in, I believe we can go ahead and just get started with some announcements. So welcome back to Module 3. As heads up for reminders, so Module 2 assignments are due tonight. If you haven't turned them in, if you need a couple more hours, please take them. But for your pitches, there are no slides or scripts that are needed. Just kind of imagine a live pitch that you would give to folks. And for the question of who are you pitching to, we'll kind of actually go ahead and define that more clearly today. So this again is an iterative process for you to gather information, gather data, and for you to sort of fully understand how you build from the bottom up, from science and information to a policy pitch and where you're going with that. Module 3 assignments after today, one-pager, as well as power mapping plan. Get those submitted into their drop boxes. There are templates, references, examples all readily available for you guys to use. They are there. If you're having troubles finding them, by all means, check the Slack, check the syllabus. They're there. If not, I can point them to you directly. All right, so moving on to our main show today. We're looking at effective advocacy for targeted types of conversations. And really, we're looking here to help you build relationships with decision makers. And we're working today in collaboration with the Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS. They will be walking us through sort of the impact and the use of power mapping, some examples. There's some independent and group work, so please anticipate that you have to talk to someone at some point. Use the chat feature, turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable doing so. I'm incredibly excited to have Melissa and Matt here today. So just very briefly, I'm going to introduce them and then we can get them passed along. Yes, I'm happy to share their email. So Melissa Vargas, she is the Science Network Community and Partnerships Manager at Union of Concerned Scientists. She manages the online community and partnerships development for the Science Network. She specializes in engaging scientists and science organizations, including us, in efforts that support long-term movement building culture towards embracing advocacy as a critical component of science role in society today. And we're also joined by her colleague, Matt Bayer. Matt Bayer is the outreach coordinator for the Climate and Energy Program. And in his role, he works with scientists, activists, coalition partners to develop strategic campaigns aimed at advancing ambitious climate, clean energy, and clean transportation solutions in California, Oregon, and Washington. And before he joined UCS, he was a student organizer for the Public Interest Research Group in California to advance the cleaner, less carbon-intensive energy systems and resources. I will apologize that I have some construction going on and a cat meowing outside, so I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and send you guys off with Melissa and Matt. So thank you all.
Hey folks, it's good to be here with you. Well, I just want to kick things off by sharing some learning objectives for the class today. We are talking about power mapping, one of my favorite things to talk about, honestly. So after this class today, you'll be able to define power mapping and describe how to use this tool to identify policymakers for the ask that you're working on for your elevator pitch. You'll understand how power mapping fits into broader policy advocacy efforts, and hopefully sharpen your elevator pitch to make it more effective for your target audience. And I'm going to hand it over to Matt to give a little context about how we think about power mapping at UCS.
Thanks, Melissa. So in a moment here, we're going to dive into what power mapping looks like, how to do it, the nitty-gritty. But before we get there, we did just want to take a step back and talk about UCS's approach to organizing scientists and science advocacy in general. As Melissa said, hopefully to give you a bit of context about why power mapping is such an important tool and how we at UCS use it sort of on a daily basis in our campaign work around science advocacy. So at UCS, for those who are maybe less familiar with our organization, our approach to science advocacy is one that really leads with the science. We go where the data, where the research tells us to. We produce technical analyses and studies, which we leverage to inform crucial policy decisions and put those decisions into practice. Crucially, however, we understand, and we think it's important to understand, that data and research alone don't always speak for themselves. In other words, just giving a decision maker information is not always sufficient to have that decision maker act on that information. Rather, we know that people must be able to give a voice to science, to advocate for science, especially in the context of the political arena, where we know that decisions are often made for a whole host of reasons that are separate from the data and information, and are often predicated on power and the distribution of that power. So who holds it, who and what those individuals are influenced by. And so this lens of sort of power distribution is really foundational to how we at UCS do our science advocacy work and sort of advocacy in general. And so at UCS, we don't just stop with technical analyses or scientific research. We have policy staff and lobbying staff who are experts in the political arena. And their role and their goal is to sort of take the data, the research that our scientists are producing, and turn that research into discrete policy recommendations, bill ideas, policy outcomes that we then actively try to seek to implement in the real world. And so those policy and lobbying staff don't just work within the political arena, but they work closely with organizers and outreach staff like myself and Melissa, whose job it is to sort of activate members of the public, particularly folks in the scientific community, like all of you here on this call, to be engaged, to be advocates for these policy solutions, to be a voice for the science, and often when needed, to put pressure on the people and institutions who are needed to actually implement the change we're seeking. But sort of before we can even get to that stage of advocating for policies or pressuring decision makers, we have to take a step back and actually recognize and identify who can actually make the change that we're hoping to see in the world. And sort of importantly and relatedly, who and what will persuade those individuals to make the change that we're asking for. And so that's what power mapping is all about, and that's where power mapping comes in. It's an exercise and a tool that we utilize in all of our campaign work and all of our science advocacy that helps us identify who the targets of our advocacy is or are, and determine the best possible approach to be able to influence them. And I think a sort of a crucial point here too is that it also allows us to identify and understand our own power in the context of that power distribution, and understand how we can best leverage our own relationships, our expertise in order to influence decision makers. And so as this training progresses, we would really encourage you all to also not just think about the power that decision makers have to implement change, but also the power that you all have as members of the scientific community, as individuals who are members of different organizations with institutional affiliations like UC Irvine or GPS STEM, and really think about the power that you all hold there. Each of you in the sort of the sum or the accumulation of your expertise on various issues, your relationships or your institutional affiliations hold power, and that power can be used to advocate for science-based, equitable policy solutions and change. And power mapping can be a really crucial and important tool that can help you unlock the most strategic pathways to hone and direct that power to actually create that change. And so hopefully that will give you, a really effective tool to be able to pursue your science advocacy. And so with that framing, I'm going to pass it over to Melissa to take us through what power mapping actually looks like and how to do it.
Thanks for teeing that up, Matt. And I almost forgot, I think we have a quick poll that we wanted to share with you all. Let's see.
Just launched.
Oh, great. Okay. I can't see it, but I trust that you all can see it. So I'll give you a minute to enter that. Okay, so looks like most of you not super familiar with power mapping. Great, that's what we're here to talk about today. And also not comfortable yet. So, okay, we can, oh, I see, there are 4 questions. Yes, got it. Well, stay tuned. We're gonna ask you these 4 questions again, I guess, at the end of the class to see if that has changed. So let's talk about what power mapping actually is. So Matt teed it up very well.
Melissa, sorry to interrupt. I think we
yeah.
need to change it to presenter view or such that the whatever you did before, that worked.
Whatever I did before. Let me close out and open it again. Okay, so as Matt mentioned, power mapping is a tool that we use in the advocacy space to help identify the relationships and pathways to help you influence the decision maker that you're targeting. And we use power mapping very frequently at UCS to help us decide on the most strategic actions to take to ensure that the messaging that we're using is resonating with our audience and to build awareness and influence on the issues that we work on. And ultimately, power mapping always starts with 3 questions. What needs to change first? So this is your goal, and it has to be concrete and measurable. You need to be able to answer the question, did this change happen or not? Yes or no. Second, where is that change made? This is usually through legislation, but it could also be through a change in organizational policy, electing a new person to a board or committee, through funding or budget allocation. But I'm guessing for most of your elevator pitches, it's going to be through legislation. And finally, who can make that change happen? This one person is going to be your target. And I know that oftentimes there are multiple possible decision makers at play when you're working on these complex issues, but it's really important to pick just one to start with. You might need to start with one and then move on to another if this is a long-term issue that you're working on, but you can only focus on one person at a time. And we'll talk more about researching who that one person is in a minute. I also want to mention that even though I'm using the word targets or target to talk about who that decision maker is that you're focused on, and that might feel confrontational or divisive, it is not meant to be. It doesn't have to be. I've used power mapping within my organization, and it was all about relationship building and helping people see how my plan was going to benefit their work. It wasn't confrontational or negative at all. So even if I use the word target, just think of it as the key decision maker. It doesn't have to be confrontational. And so once you have that key decision maker in mind, you need to do a little bit of background research on what might help move them to help craft your pitch and your approach to them. I believe that you received a link to our toolkit with 10 questions on researching policymakers. But just wanted to review 5 sample questions to get started on researching your target. So first, what have they said on this issue before? Have they spoken about it publicly? Do they have information on their website about it? Have they voted on this issue or a similar issue in the past? Do they belong to committees that are actively working on this issue? Second, what do they stand to win by saying yes to your request, or stand to lose by saying no? And remember that self-interest is a real motivator. So if you're asking them to get involved in something risky, they're going to be thinking about re-election if they're an elected official. So that might help you think about how you shape your tone of your approach in your pitch. Who can directly influence them? This could be folks who helped them get where they are, like mentors or senior colleagues. It might be folks who have influence over where they want to go next, whether they have an eye on maybe a higher elected office or a different position. Also, who is most impacted by this issue and has a direct stake in this issue, who might be able to directly influence this target. Beyond just who influences them, whose opinion do they really care about? Are there particular voting blocks that they seem to have curried favor from in a recent election? Did they go out of their way to show up at events for certain types of groups? And if so, can you show that this group is impacted by the issue that you're working on? And finally, why haven't they acted on the issue that you are working on if they haven't acted yet? So once you've done a little bit of research around this, that can help you start to craft your pitch and your approach. I do want to offer one caveat at this point. Power mapping is a very valuable advocacy tool, but I want you to be realistic about what you can offer if you're only taking on this issue as an individual. We do this as an organization, and we have different resources and tools that we can offer. But if you're thinking about engaging just as yourself, make sure you're not over-promising what you can offer them. That said, you still have a lot that you can offer as you make your ask. Maybe it's expertise or research. Maybe it's not just the facts that back up your issue, but putting those facts into context, helping them see what this means specifically for their district or their constituents. Maybe they need to see more data on this issue to help them make a decision. Can you show that their constituents support them if they get involved on this issue? Do you have any proof that there's public interest and support on this topic? And can you offer other connections, maybe connections to other folks on campus, other groups or institutions that you belong to, professional groups, things like that. And remember to keep in mind what you can't offer them, whether that's, if you don't have time to do additional research on this issue, don't offer to do that, because ultimately this is about building a relationship. And one final piece to think about is timing. When would your target be most likely to listen when you go to give your pitch to them? When do they have to make a decision on this issue? If it's related to a piece of legislation, has that legislation been introduced? Is there a vote coming up? Also think about what else might be preoccupying their time right now. Elections obviously take up all of the energy in the room when they're coming up, so that's something to consider. Also think about, is there any energy around this issue? Is this something that you'll be bringing up to them for the first time, that it would be a new thing, or is this something that's already in the news? Unless you're working on a really hot button issue, it will likely take multiple touch points to build a relationship and influence your target. So sometimes the best time to start is just right now, recognizing that it's going to take multiple meetings, multiple touch points, like I said, and there will be other opportune times to take different types of action. So consider this elevator pitch the first part of a longer term effort to build a relationship with your target that you're hoping to influence. I'm going to hand it back to Matt so he can put some of this into context again for us with a case study.
Thanks, Melissa. I also just want to acknowledge, I know there's a couple of questions in the chat. Melissa, I'll defer to you in terms of when would be a good time to answer. Maybe we can answer some before we do breakouts, but I also just want to note for everybody, we'll have some time at the end to answer questions. So there should be enough time to get to everybody's questions. But yes, like Melissa said, Melissa just took us through sort of what power mapping looks like in theory, the sort of questions and the considerations you want to take into account when doing this. And we want to sort of present you with a case study of how we've actually used power mapping in the work that UCS has done, with the hope that it sort of contextualizes what this might actually look like in practice. And so in this is a specific example of work that I and the team I was involved with at UCS worked on earlier this year. And so I want to provide a bit of context so you understand sort of the basics. So earlier this year, UCS was engaged in efforts to pass crucial climate change policies in Oregon during their state legislative session. This included a number of different issues, but among them was decarbonizing buildings and ensuring that neighborhoods and cities are run on cleaner, fossil fuel-free, sustainable energy. And so we were making considerable progress on this work throughout the session, and thanks to a number of different advocates within the community. Unfortunately, progress was derailed midway through the session when a contingent of Republicans in the state Senate walked out of session to boycott proposed abortion and gender-affirming care legislation. That walkout prevented the Oregon State Legislature from reaching quorum, which, based on their procedural bylaws, meant that they weren't allowed to convene in order to debate, consider, or subsequently, obviously, pass legislation, which, of course, was the intended effect of the walkout. That, of course, left UCS in a bit of a predicament and an uncertain position. We were looking to create change to pass climate policies this session, but how do you go about doing that when the decision makers who are responsible for doing that aren't even allowed to convene in order to discuss those policies? So we knew we wanted to create change, but we were in a position where we didn't immediately know how to do that. Of course, some of those questions should be familiar because they're some of the foundational questions Melissa just took us through. Where can you create change and who can do it? And so power mapping became a really crucial tool for us to be able to address this predicament and figure out a path forward that would allow us to create climate policy change in Oregon during this session. And so we endeavored with power mapping. And just like Melissa sort of outlined at the beginning, we started with those three basic questions. So we asked ourselves what needed to change. And of course, we had already had a sense of this. We were committed during that session to passing strong climate change-related policies in Oregon that year. Then we had to ask ourselves, where can that change be made? Under normal circumstances, we have a pretty good idea of that. Under the current circumstances where the Republicans were walking out of session and normal procedure couldn't occur as scheduled, that question wasn't immediately answerable. And so we had to do a considerable amount of research, which included both talking to a lot of our allies, our partners, folks who have spent considerable time at the Oregon Capitol who have a deep understanding of Oregon's legislative bylaws. And one path that we identified to be able to move forward, short of convincing the boycotting legislators from returning to session, which we thought was going to be a very tough ask, was to convince sympathetic state legislators in the Oregon legislature to call a special session. And I won't dive too deeply into the sort of technical details of what a special session is or how it works, mostly because, frankly, I don't understand them. But for the purposes of this case study, what you need to know is that a special session was a procedural option that the Oregon legislators had, where they could pass various budget-related items, as well as specific legislation that had budget requests, like some of the climate legislation we were advocating for. And so it seemed to us a likely avenue and arena where we could create the change we were wanting to see, given the circumstances that we were faced with. So we had identified what needed to change and where that change could possibly happen. We then needed to determine who could possibly make that change. And again, we did a considerable amount of research, which included talking to our allies, talking to folks who were quite familiar with procedures in the Oregon legislature. And based on that research, we determined that the Senate Majority Leader in Oregon, the Democratic Senator Kate Lieber, was the key member who had the authority to call and initiate a special session. So we knew that a special session was our likely avenue to be able to create change. And now we had identified the individual who had the authority to be able to do that. So we had identified where change could be made and who can make that change. And so with that target identified, we then began to conduct our research on Kate Lieber to determine the best possible strategy to be able to advocate and convince her that climate policy was not only a priority, but that calling a special session in order to pass climate policy was crucial. And we did this work with an Oregon-based member of our science network, an individual who's part of our supporter base, who is a local Oregon climate advocate, and an occupational health scientist. And so we went through all of the questions that Melissa sort of outlined earlier in the presentation to determine what would be the key motivators, key issues, and key allies that would best influence Senator Kate Lieber. And I won't go through all of them for the sake of time, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the key pieces of our research that really informed our advocacy to give you a bit of a sense about what this looks like in practice and the types of things we're often looking for when we're power mapping legislators. So for instance, one of the big pieces of our research that was really crucial in forming our advocacy strategy was understanding that for Kate Lieber, public health was a major priority for her office. We did a lot of research. We looked at her website. We took a look at how she was messaging during her electoral campaigns, the priorities that she was talking about to her constituents. We were also looking at the legislation that she was sponsoring during that session and what types of topics that she was choosing. And public health was a major theme throughout all of those areas. And so we knew that that was a really important messaging tool for her and something that was really important to her and her office. And so we knew we were going to be talking about climate change, but we also decided that it would be important and strategic when messaging to Kate Lieber to really focus on the dangers that climate change poses to public health and fossil fuel production, whether it's pollution from fossil fuels or extreme weather conditions like forest fires or the extreme heat in summers that Oregon often gets. And of course, we had the expertise to be able to leverage those resources and really focus on that messaging, given that we were working with an occupational health scientist who had a lot of really good information and resources on and firsthand experience on, for instance, extreme weather conditions and how that impacts folks in the workplace, particularly Oregon's outdoor workforce. Another key piece of information that was really central to creating our advocacy strategy was understanding that one of Kate Lieber's major sponsors or endorsers during her electoral campaign were labor unions and organizations that represented outdoor workers and farm workers in Oregon. And so this is really important when you think about who are the allies that influence a decision maker. Understanding that there was a very clear contingent of supporters during her electoral campaign that got to her to where she currently is in office was a really important discovery for us. And so a lot of these labor unions and organizations that represented outdoor workers and farm workers were organizations that we had actually worked with in the past on various climate-related issues that sort of overlapped between climate, environmental, and labor fields. And so we were able to collaborate with those individuals in preparing for advocating to Kate Lieber to develop some shared messaging, shared priorities, so that we could not only elevate the messaging and the perspectives of those groups, but also elevate the work that they were doing on our shared priorities and issues. And of course, we knew that that would likely be a fruitful strategy, as these were voices that we knew Kate Lieber's office particularly valued. And so using all of that information and sort of considerable research outside of that, we were able to create a sort of coherent strategic advocacy strategy that we felt really confident would not only be effective in persuading Kate Lieber, but would really speak to the interests and the allyships that she has. And so with the occupational health scientist who was part of our science network, we were able to host a meeting with Senator Lieber's staff and office and really urge them to make climate action a priority and to call a special session if that was what was needed in order to pass climate legislation that session in the case that the Republicans did not return to the legislature. And we found this to be a really fruitful tactic and a really fruitful advocacy strategy. As a result of this effort, a couple of weeks later, Senate Democratic leadership in Oregon put together and announced several key legislative bill packages that were priorities for them for the remainder of session. Among those packages was a climate package that included the bills that we had advocated for and were urging Senator Lieber to pass. And so this is just one example of sort of how in a situation where we weren't quite sure of how to create change, we went through the steps that were sort of foundational to power mapping, determined who our target was, how best to engage with them, and then developed a strategy that we were able to execute in a way that was, I believe, particularly influential and influential to the specific target that we had identified. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context about what all of this looks like in practice and some of the specific questions you might want to ask yourself when thinking about the own targets and issues that you're also considering. And I'll pass it back to Melissa at this point to do some walkthroughs.
Great. Yeah, so I wanted to do sort of a live walkthrough based on an example of some advocacy that I've done right here in my neighborhood, to give you a sense of what it can look like to start doing some of this research. All right, hopefully y'all can see the beautiful website of Councilwoman Janice Lewis George. So I live in DC. In 2020, the DC Public Library announced plans to close my local library branch. As a big library supporter, I was very upset by this, and so were many of my neighbors and others in my community. Especially because this plan came out with very little justification and no community engagement that was shared with us. So we started organizing. And one of the first targets that we identified was our council member, Janice Lewis George. This is her website. This is one of the first places I went to start putting together this advocacy plan that we were working on. I actually knew a little bit about her before this issue came up because she was just elected in 2020. So if you, this is a pretty typical elected official website, which is very helpful for this example. Let's see, so usually there's a bio page, which is what we're on now. If you scroll down, you can see all of the committees that she's on as part of the council, including the Committee on Recreation, Libraries, and Youth Affairs, which was very helpful for our local advocacy effort. She probably would have been a target for us anyway, since she represents the ward where our library is. But since she's also on this committee that represents libraries or that is involved in library affairs, it means she's going to have even more power over the decision to save our branch. Another thing that I noticed in looking through her bio and her website is that she really talks a lot about justice and equity and public service and giving back to the community. And the final thing that I wanted to call out on this bio page was that she lives in Manor Park in Ward 4. And I know that probably doesn't mean anything to you all, but this is good information to know because based on a recent library report in DC, it said that the Manor Park neighborhood was currently underserved by the library system. So keep that in mind. Another thing you'll often see on an elected official's website is their legislative priorities. And you can see she has quite a list of issues that she cares about and that she's following. So I usually do a quick cheat. And if you just search for library on their webpage, what comes up for her is just a mention of her role on this committee again. But you can see it talks mostly about her efforts to expand youth programs. To me, that suggested that libraries might not be her top priority. And that's okay. It just meant that when we're approaching her, we were going to have to do some education, that this wasn't going to be her top priority necessarily. Another great thing to look for is staff, especially for if you're talking to state or federal elected officials. It's really good to have a sense of if they have staff who are specifically working on the issue that you're focused on. I'll just do a quick skim so you can see she has a lot of staff for a city council person, which is awesome. I'm glad that she's so well supported. But again, if you do a quick little search, I don't see anyone who's specifically working on libraries, which is probably understandable. But we use this information to reach out to, for example, her chief of staff to invite both Kelly Hunt and Councilmember Janice Lewis-George to some of the meetings and community events that we were having around the library. So how do we bring this all together and use this to create a power map and craft our advocacy approach? Well, because she was on this committee that oversees libraries, we asked her to push the public library system to release more information about their decision to close our branch. And what came out of that was some information around, they wanted to move the branch farther south. So what we came up with was a 2-library solution that would keep our branch open in its current location and allocate funding for a new branch to serve neighborhoods in the south, such as Manor Park, where the council member lives. And we talked about this as an equity issue. It wasn't fair that the communities to the south didn't have easy access to a library, but moving our branch further south would also create a service gap and be an equity issue. So talking about this as an issue of equity and access helped get the council member on board, but also helped build community support for this idea of a 2-library solution. And I will just wrap it up to say, ultimately, we were successful. We got $25 million allocated for a new library in Manor Park, which is very exciting, and we get to keep our branch up here in Shepherd Park. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what it could look like to comb through all of this information on an elected official's website or a decision maker's website. Matt, did you also want to share a quick example?
Sure, yeah, I can share a quick example of some work that we're currently doing and what it might look like for us to power map when we eventually get to that point. So for context, and I'll share my screen in just a second to walk through some resources like Melissa did, but for context, UCS recently released an analysis that found that pollution in California from older vehicles, that is vehicles, gas vehicles made before the year 2004, cause significant pollution burden that disproportionately falls on Latinx and Black communities, as well as low-income communities in the state. And so we're really looking to push California to prioritize these disproportionately impacted communities in their efforts to phase out gas vehicles and provide incentives for electric vehicles, as well as non-vehicle-based transit like public transportation. So we want to figure out who can who's best in a best position to be the decision maker that can get us there. And one place that I'd probably start, and I'm going to skip some steps here, but would just be to look at the California legislature, our decision makers, and see who in the legislature is actually focused on electric vehicles. And so I'm skipping some steps, but if you sort of type in, California State Assembly and electric vehicles, you might find, for instance, the Select Committee on Electric Vehicles and Charging Infrastructure. That's obviously a great place to start. These are the segments of California's state legislature that is most concerned with electric vehicles and incentive programs. And so that might lead me to, for instance, Assemblywoman Pilar Schiavo. And so this would be a good place to start, just like Melissa did on Assemblywoman Schiavo's website. And so I already know that she's likely tuned in and cares about the issues that we're talking about and has a discrete interest in hearing the message that we want to provide. Another thing that I might identify is when thinking about who actually influences her, is thinking about who does she represent. So I see she's in District 40. I could do a quick Google search to find out where that is. That's the Santa Clarita area of California. So in the Southern California area. And that would be important for me because I know that our report shows that the pollution impacts of older vehicles are disproportionately focused on the Southern California region, particularly the greater Los Angeles area, and overlaps considerably with the constituency that she represents. So that would be an important piece of information that I took away. Another thing that I'd probably be curious about when researching Assemblywoman Schiavo is what's her background? What did she do maybe before she became a politician? And that would help me get an insight into what motivates her, what are the issues that she cares about, and maybe what are the relationships that she holds that influences how she thinks about policy issues. So a quick Google search could bring you to this page, where you might learn that Assemblymember Schiavo, prior to her work in the California state legislature, had a background in organized labor. She worked for the San Francisco Labor Council, as well as the California Nurses Association. Again, this is just a document you could pull up in a quick Google search. And what this tells me is that she obviously, organized labor is an important part, likely, of her motivations for policy decisions. A lot of her connections are likely within this community. And it likely informs the decisions that she makes and the relationships that she holds. And so if I was then going to take that information, you'd likely want to do, there would likely be additional research that you did, but just on those 3 pieces alone, I could formulate a strategy that says, we're going to focus on electric vehicles and really emphasizing the responsibility that she has in her role on the chair of the Select Committee for EVs and Infrastructure. We would really want to highlight the specific impact that older vehicle pollution has on the residents of Santa Clarita and her responsibility to her constituencies and their public health, and that we could collaborate with labor allies in the organized labor space and create some joint or shared advocacy work that could really highlight the perspective of organized labor, as well as potentially folks at the San Francisco Labor Council or California Nurses Association to really elevate the voices that are most important to her or likely that she hears considerably in her work. And so those are just like 3 pieces of quick information that you could very easily ascertain from quick Google searches that could make really important strategic decisions in how you would develop an advocacy strategy. So hopefully that's just a bit of a sort of a snapshot about what some of that research could likely look like in practice.
I'm loving all of these questions. Matt, let's maybe take a few minutes to answer some questions before we send people off away to do some of this work. Okay, so hopefully I haven't missed any. I was taking some notes. I'll try to start at the top. So is the bill sponsor, regardless of whether you support or oppose the bill, someone that is considered a useful target, or is it already too late? Matt, do you want to take this one? If not, I have thoughts.
Yes, I can share some thoughts and then happy for you to join in as well. Yes, I would say absolutely. A bill sponsor is definitely a useful target. And I would say it depends on what you want to do. So I would distinguish power mapping from creating a strategy to change someone's mind. It might be that could be part of power mapping, but power mapping is really identifying an individual who is best positioned to make the change that you want to happen. And so it depends on what your goal is. So a bill sponsor might be the best target for you to power map if they're in a position to create the change you want to see. And so it depends on what you want to see. If you oppose the bill and want to see it killed, that's one goal. If you support the bill and want to see it passed, that's another. But you could also simply not have a position on a bill and would like to see, say, language or specific technical aspects of a bill changed. In which case, the bill sponsor would be the person who could most easily do that, would be best positioned to make that happen. So I would really say it starts with your goal. You have to identify what you actually want to change. And then understanding whether or not the bill sponsor is the person to be able to do that will be a question from there. But yes, I think just because the bill sponsor's position is sort of known, it's never too late for them to be a target.
Great answer. So I'm going to move on to the next question. Julie asked, what are some examples of things UCS is able to offer as an organization? Because we are a membership organization with about 500,000 members and supporters, we can offer things like shows of public support. So getting people to show up to events, demonstrating their support through calls and emails to the office, having scientists demonstrate their support for an issue or share their research on an issue through letters or bringing them into meetings. We also have scientists on staff who are like paid to do this work. So we can do some rapid response analysis to show what the impacts might be in their congressional district or their state, if that type of research is useful. And also could call on those experts to testify on the Hill, or to even offer some sample legislative language if that's useful. Matt, anything I missed? Cool. I love this question. What would be an alternative way to approach a target who does not have an open profile like a website or is not easily approachable? No, Matt, do you have any initial response to that?
I think relationships are a good place to start. So understand who they likely talk to, who they likely interact with, and either use that as a way to gain more information on them, or use those individuals as a way to influence the target that you've identified. I also think speaking to other folks who are advocating in this space can be really helpful. A lot of the information that we have about specific targets, whether they be legislators or folks who work at agencies, is from experience that we have working with them and from working with other folks in the community who have worked with them. And so that can often be a good place to start, is to actually talking to other people who have experience advocating in the space that you're working in.
And another thing to consider is to think about a little bit more of a step-by-step approach to the elevator pitch. Your first pitch might be, I want to learn more about the work that you do and what some of your priorities are, and just go in with a real listening approach so that you can better understand how you can bring a more specific ask in a future conversation. I think I answered some of these. Gabrielle asked, my understanding is that a target can be an ally or an opponent. Yes. How do you decide on which to target? Is that an active decision, or is that determined by the issue? Is there a benefit for specifically targeting an opponent? I think this goes back to what Matt was saying earlier about what is your ultimate goal. Obviously, there might be multiple targets that you could reach out to for a particular issue, in which case it might often be easier to start with an ally, and that's not a bad thing, to build support and to demonstrate support on an issue. I don't know that there's necessarily a benefit for specifically targeting an opponent. I don't know, Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can imagine a situation in which there is an opponent who is the clear obstacle to what you want happen. Again, I mean, I think this goes back to what Melissa was saying. It really depends on what your goal is and who is best positioned to get you there. Sometimes it might be developing a champion who really supports you and can push your issue over the line. Sometimes it might be someone who is on the fence, who might be delving into the opponent territory, and who is maybe like the one vote that you need to pass a bill or to move a regulation forward. In that case, it can be strategic to focus on someone who might not directly see eye to eye with you. But again, I think it does depend on who is the sort of crucial lever that you need to pull in order to get the change that you want to see passed. And that does depend, it is somewhat contingent on what the issue is and the specific dynamics related to what you're working on.
The questions are coming in very quickly now, and I also want to make sure that you all have time to actually do some of this research and reflection on your own. So I'm going to try to take one more question. If your focus is on an area that generally applies to, or that applies generally, such as climate change related policy, how do you decide what level of government is best to target? Yeah, so we've chosen state governments, though I will just acknowledge that DC is not a state. However, I think that there's value in starting locally. If there is meaningful targets and a vehicle for creating change at the local level, I think that's a really great way to get started because local decision makers are often more accessible than those at the federal and sometimes even at the state level. And there can be really impactful work that's done at the local level, and that's change that people see every single day in their lives. So I would put in a plug for starting, at a local or state level rather than immediately defaulting to federal, just because also the federal level policy takes a very long time to be introduced and passed. Matt, agree, disagree? Okay. Great. So I want to make sure that you all have some time to do this, and we will reconvene and answer more questions as well. Sorry that we didn't get to as many of them right now, but we're going to take, I think, like, in the interest of time, let's take 6 or 7 minutes for you all to start doing some individual research and reflection on your own. You can turn off your cameras if you want. And then we will send you into breakout groups so you can chat about what you've learned with your fellow classmates. And I'll put a couple, put a couple questions in the chat for you to talk through with your classmates. So is there anything you need to change about your initial approach to the elevator pitch? What's important to your decision maker that you're going to work into your pitch to help strengthen your approach? And maybe this should be the first question. Do you still feel like you've chosen the right decision maker for your pitch? And we'll take, I think, 10-ish minutes in breakout groups for you to share those. All right, so let's take 6-ish minutes for individual reflection, and then Joanne's going to help send you into breakout groups, and you'll be able to call on Matt or I if you have questions and need help in those breakout groups too. So see you back here in a little bit. We're all back. I know you all have lots of questions, and I am eager to dig into them and hear about what you chatted about in the breakout groups. But before we do that, we're going to relaunch that poll that you saw earlier, just to get a little bit of a sense of, have we clarified anything for you? Some movement. Now more folks are familiar with power mapping, and wow, all right, I am so glad to see that some of you are comfortable with thinking about using power mapping as an advocacy tool. That's amazing. Thank you for weighing in and for all of your questions and attention. I think we're going to open it up to Q&A and any reflections that you want to share from the breakout rooms. We have about 10 minutes to do that, and then Matt and I wanted to share just a couple final action opportunities and requests to wrap up. So if you asked a question earlier that we have not answered, if I could ask you to re-enter it in the chat or raise your hand so we can call on you. I've a little bit lost the chat at this point. And feel free to raise your hand, come off mute. We'd love to hear you. But right now I see Julie's question and comment. I feel like before launching into power mapping, I need a better understanding of how decisions work in general, decision making in general. Are there any resources on this? Oh, Matt, any resources that immediately come to mind?
There are, I think, resources that you can look into on sort of the basics of either your state legislative bodies as well as the federal legislative bodies, and understanding sort of like who's in what positions, who's in what committees, and how those committees interact on a sort of structural level, I think is a good sort of basic survey sort of resource that you can look into. But I think it's a really good point about how sort of decision making interacts in maybe specifically like informal routes, and especially when it gets into sort of regulatory issues and questions of technicalities. I think that's a really good point. Melissa, I'm wondering if we have any Science Network resources that are sort of one pagers or sort of immediate documents that we can use as sort of primers for people to get folks comfortable with at least sort of the basics.
Yeah, let me dig up some of our resources and send those over to Joanne so she can send them out after the class, just so you all can have something to dig into a little bit. I will also say that if you're truly feeling lost about where to start, I would start looking into who represents you at the local, state, or federal level, and not worrying about like, of all the people in all the world who care about your issue, who is the right one. Often the best place to start is, who are you a constituent of, because they're more likely to take a meeting with you, and that's a good way to get started. I see that. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say one other thing that came to mind is talking to people who are working on advocacy in the area you're interested in, and even just to sit down or a coffee to understand, the work that they're doing. They'll likely have, one really great way to understand how processes and decision making works is to actually be in the work and doing it. And so folks who have that experience can be really great resources to and support networks to be able to understand how you can get involved in and engage with those decision-making processes.
I see Favor is raising their hand.
Yeah, thank you. So a question that I had and I brought up within the breakout room too, and maybe someone else is struggling, is how to target policymakers in an area where the problem you're trying to solve is not so confined to maybe an individual policymaker. For example, the field of neuroethics, which is what I'm interested in, a lot of the work being done are primarily within councils or initiatives or committees or working groups. It's very rare to find somebody whose like personal stance or initiative does anything, especially because the most recent examples of things succeeding were constitutional amendments being added to Chile's and in Brazil. So the changes needed are just so wide or broad that I'm really struggling to like find, even at the state level, anyone that I could really go through to target this. And I wonder if there are resources geared towards targeting groups of policymakers.
Mm. Rather than targeting a whole group of policymakers, I wonder if this is an area where it might be appropriate to target someone who's working within an organization to ask them to prioritize this issue a little bit more. Is this something that you can get a scientific society to list as a priority or to invest more of their effort in? Just wondering if there's like almost thinking of an institution or an organization as a secondary target to help raise awareness as part of a longer term effort. Although I'm very intrigued by the idea of
if I can hop on also, I'm also working on a project that is involved in like neuroethics, like that's the focus of my pitch. And what I've been doing to be able to find people is finding legislators that have contributed to research regarding neuroethics or have ties to those programs. And if you'd like, we can link up on Slack and I can share with you what I found.
Yes, that would be amazing if you please share. For some reason, it's not showing exactly who's talking. It's like everyone's showing. So please hit me up on the side. Thank you.
Amazing. Matt, is there any question that's caught your eye that you want to raise up?
I just wanted to note this question that I think was posted earlier on. What happens if it's difficult to find a policymaker who's interested in the change you want to see? I think an important first step here is thinking about education as a strategy. So advocacy doesn't have to start with a specific ask or a specific policy solution, but you can meet with a decision maker, you can engage with a political body, just to sort of share either research that you've done or information on the issue that you care about, and share why that's important to you and why it should be important to them. And I think further advocacy can sort of blossom from that. But really, I think it's a good opportunity to start developing relationships with folks you think could be really good champions for your issues, by beginning to socialize and create good educational material about why that issue should be important to the political arena. So that would be my advice there. Also to the point that the previous question about difficulties figuring out how to target large groups of people, I would also add maybe it's a good opportunity to start tiering out and breaking down specific goals. So rather than saying, I need to find one target who will help champion my issue through everything I want to do, maybe identify some specific, discrete, as Melissa said at the beginning, measurable goals that you can accomplish. So one of those might be, I just want a city council member to present a resolution on my issue. And there's a specific target who I have in mind for that. Maybe a separate goal is, though, I just want a city council member to give a presentation to their colleagues on my issue and why it's important, to help educate them and present why that issue should be considered by the council. And that might be a separate target altogether. So you don't need to think about power mapping as one target that will do every single thing you want on your issue. It might be helpful to start breaking down some specific goals and figuring out who the best targets are for each of those.
I want to share a couple final links for folks to stay connected. I also want to offer, actually the first link I was going to share with you all is reach out to me on LinkedIn. I know that most of you already have, which is fantastic. I would love to answer more of these questions. Joanne, I don't know if you're doing any office hours, but I'd be happy to join for a future office hour or have something informal where I'm doing something on chat or on Slack, just to make sure that folks feel supported as they're working on their power maps. So I also want to invite you to join the Science Network if you haven't already. Joanne will share these links in the chat and afterwards, so you don't have to worry about losing them. Join the Science Network so you can stay in touch with us, but also so you can learn more about different types of opportunities to get involved in policy advocacy, see how we're shaping our messaging and who we're targeting, so you can get a little sneak peek behind the scenes and how we're approaching our advocacy. We also offer a lot of trainings and webinars on science advocacy skills. One specific action you can take right now is to send a comment to the Senate Agricultural Committee on what they should prioritize in the Farm Bill, which is up for renewal. This is a massive piece of legislation. It's renewed every 5 years, and it's a tremendous opportunity to make sure that we're prioritizing climate and racial equity, and they're accepting comments, I believe, at least through August. So you can weigh in and craft some comments specifically geared towards members of that committee about what they should be prioritizing in that final bill. And finally, if you are really interested in power mapping and want to start doing more of this on your own with your own priorities, maybe you're like, the elevator pitch is not enough. I want to build a whole campaign around what I'm working on. I encourage you to check out team-based organizing. It's an initiative designed to support scientists in launching their own science advocacy group. And we offer support on how to build those advocacy skills, community organizing skills, helping you think through campaign strategy and making real, tangible policy change on the issues that you're working on. And finally, here's your homework. You've already started it. You will have access to a Google Doc, which you can download as a template. It's 5 deceivingly simple questions, right? What is the topic of your pitch? Who is your target? A little bit of information about them. What are their primary motivations? What is your angle based on this research? And what is the opportune time to pitch your target based on this research? Not looking for anything more than really 1 page or so, just to get a sense of, have you really done some digging into who that one person should be that you're focusing your pitch on, so you can really make the most effective argument. With that, I think that's all we have time for. This was really fun. Hopefully this got you thinking about ways to sharpen your pitch, and hopefully we didn't scare you off too much. But like I said, I'll be available if folks want to chat offline or have additional questions.
Alrighty, thank you so much. Everyone give a round of applause, send some thank yous in chat. I will send out an email with all the links that we talked about today, and I'll be here to catch any lingering questions. Otherwise, thank you all. Have a good rest of your day. See you guys next week.